God who came.
Hallelujah, what a Savior, bearing shame and scoffing rude. In my place condemned he stood, sealed my pardon with his blood. Hallelujah, what a Savior.
God bless you, Brother Terry. Two great songs and great hymns. Still stir the heart, don't they? All right, we're picking up our series. We're teaching through Judges. Judges, the record of Israel's national failure. And this is lesson number 23. Just seems like yesterday. We're in chapter 15 of Judges, and we're in the what I count and my judge count, because I count Deborah and Barak both as judges, one in the sense of the gavel and under the oak tree, and the other, both in a military campaign, but Barak, they're listed in Hebrews 11. I count them both as judges. So Samson would be the 13, and he is the last because he's going to take us to chapters 17 through 21. And there we're having two just tremendous stories that kind of an overview, underscoring that this was a lawless time. The Bible talks a lot about lawlessness. And in Judges it's stated this way, that everyone did that which was right, in their own eyes. And there's a real parallel. It's just amazing. God's word's always current. But as we go through these wonderful chapters, we can see such parallels in our own lives and nation and culture. So we've entitled this lesson 23, Samson, God's Freedom Fighter. And in his book, The Tyranny of Cliches, Jonah Goldberg addresses the phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I just thought I would put that in there and really stir things up. Goldberg writes, it is simply absurd to contend that because people may argue over who is or who is not a terrorist, that it is therefore impossible to make meaningful distinctions between terrorists and freedom fighters. So he's on the record in his book of saying it's absurd. There is a difference. Like a lot of cliches, what many people mean when they say one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is that if they agree with the ends or the objectives of the person or group in question, then they tend to overlook the means or the tactics being used, and therefore don't think of them as terrorists, but rather as freedom fighters. We tend to vilify the actions only of groups which we wish to discredit. So was Mahatma Gandhi a terrorist? No. I don't think he was. Was Martin Luther King Jr. a terrorist? No. Was bin Laden a freedom fighter? Was Soleimani, Iranian Soleimani, is he a respected general? Or is he a terrorist? Well, it's amazing. It's amazing. So now let's talk about Samson. Unlike any other judge in so many ways. And this lesson really points it out. Here in Judges 15, we observe the development of God's purpose in Samson's life. I want to understand, he's the only judge who comes to the forefront minus the outcry of the people. They weren't looking for a judge. They weren't looking for a deliverer. Are y'all with me? Nor was Samson particularly interested in that. He is the only judge that was purposed to be a judge before he was born, from the womb. I think in the Old Testament there's 3 people that had a Nazirite vow from birth in the Bible. And Samson is one of them. So he's coming to terms with God's purpose and as God's freedom fighter. Okay? Because in most cases, judges are just that. They're military deliverers of Israel as they complete yet another cycle of sin. Are y'all with me? So let's get into the chapter. But it came to pass within a while after, okay, in the time of the wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. Now, we're not sure how much time has passed here, but we're informed that Samson returned to visit his wife during the season of wheat harvest, which would be May or June. And apparently, Samson, as we finished the last chapter, the end of chapter 14, he's gotten over his fit of rage by killing 30 Philistines to satisfy his riddle wager, okay? I started to say his gambling debt, but that's not what it was. And so he needed 30 changes of raiment, so he just went out and got them. So Samson doesn't visit his wife as he comes back home. He's smart. He doesn't have chocolates or flowers, but he does have a kid, a young goat, perhaps an offering of reconciliation. And it picks up in verse 1, it continues, and he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber. So it's a shame for a bride to be left standing at the altar. It's a shame for a bride to not have her vows consummated. And so Samson here is seeking to reconcile with his wife and to consummate the marriage that was never consummated. Verse 1, but her father would not suffer him to do so. So the bride's father, well, he had other ideas. He refused to let Samson visit his daughter bride. And so Samson's beginning to discover that he may have lost his wife to be. Verse 2, and her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst surely hated her, because I gave her to your best man. I gave her to your companion. Now, if you remember, because Samson's bride betrayed him, right? I mean, we've already said this. You wound a man's pride, something's going to die. You know, a relationship, a man's pride is a problem. So he's betrayed. She's betrayed him. She shares the answer to the riddle with her family. And he comes home angry. He gets very angry and, has to settle the debt, right? Kills 30 Philistines. So here's the interesting, because what God has done, and he's still doing. You'll see it here. We've already seen it. His personal relationship and conflicts with his wandering eye and his relationship with women becomes a national issue. And so by hook or crook, God is going to deliver this people whether they want it or not, which kind of is a lesson about sanctification, because who regenerates, He also sanctifies, it says in Romans chapter 8. And hopefully that's with our compliance. But if you belong to the Lord, His plan for you and me is to be sanctified, and we're predestined to be conformed. And that's the number one purpose for our lives. Nothing else. It says in Romans 8, to be conformed to the image of Christ. And so God's going to deliver Israel through Samson, even if it means bringing the house down on his head. Do y'all understand that? So it's serious business claiming to be a child of God. And with privilege comes responsibility. And I think we have a decision in that. We have compliance. There's all kinds of sub-themes. So the father basically says, I thought you hated her. I didn't think you were going to come back, so I gave her to the best man, right? His companion. So Samson lost. He's facing that. There's consequence. Verse 2 concludes, is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. So it sounds like Laban here. Samson became upset, and so he gave away his wife to the best man, and so the father's trying to appease. Now, he's come to know Samson's kind of like the Incredible Hulk. I mean, he gets mad, and he's seen him when he's mad, and he don't want him. No, don't get mad. Samson says, no deal. No deal. Verse 3. And Samson said concerning them, okay, now I shall be more blameless or innocent or without blame or justified than the Philistines. And so we're getting in this cycle of revenge. Boy, that's going on in the Middle East. Okay, so that should settle it. Okay. I'll be more blameless or without blame or justified than the Philistines, though what I'm about to do to them, though I do them a displeasure. So Samson's personal concerns, here we go again, continue to become national concerns. And instead of striking out against the family of his bride, he focuses his wrath against the Philistines in general, just like he took out 30 Philistines earlier with the problem with his bridal party and the whole thing about the wager and the riddle. And so Samson believes that his act of retaliation is more justified than the Philistines' actions. And since it's wheat harvest, and speaking of terrorism, I'll just burn up their fields. I'll just do this. Verses 4 and 5 describes the destruction of the Philistines' wheat harvest. That may not move you, but if you're an agriculturer, and that's all you got, and there's no food stamps, so that's pretty serious business. The Midianites, if you remember, were doing that to Israel. So it describes the destruction of the Philistines' wheat harvest. And really, it's interesting, systematically, basically in 5 steps. Verse 4, and Samson went and caught 300 foxes. They would like to do that. I got a job for you. Now, the Hebrew there, it covers the whole species. So it could be foxes, it could be jackals, all that family. They say jackals are a little bigger, and they run in packs more than foxes. So if I'm having to find 300 foxes one by one, I don't know how long that's going to take. But I'm not interested in that at all. So he's got to catch them. Verse 4, take firebrands, which are basically pieces of wood that are wrapped in some absorbent material, soaked in oil, ready to burn, right? 4 turned tail to tail, so reduces the 300 foxes or jackals to 150 pairs. Boy, can you think about that? And then put a firebrand in the midst of each pair. After he's tied them together in pairs. And then, verse 5, then he had set the brands on fire and let them go. We have a phrase in here in Texas, run like a scalded dog. Run like your tail is on fire into the standing corn or wheat of the Philistines. So you can just see him going about this. You know? We were talking about, I hate to keep referencing to terrorism. I'm not calling him a terrorist. But one man's terrorist is enough. But anyway. So he, pair 1, light it, bye boys, and off and off and off. And so he sends out his pairs and his fires. And he knows that they're going to zigzag and maximize the damage. And verse 5 concludes, and burn up. Notice, the stalks, the standing wheat or corn, with the vineyards and the olives. And so when Samson struck against the Philistine economy, right, he hit them where it hurt. So the Philistines now, okay, now we're settled. Yeah, right? Well, the Philistines respond to Samson's destruction of their crops by incinerating his bride and her family, her father. Verse 6. The Philistines said, well, I'm more justified than you. Who hath done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he hath taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. So here we go. It's this personal thing involving women. And, the marriage first and all of this. And yet the Philistines take advantage not so much yet on Samson in person, but people attached to him, of which he takes out back on the Philistines. So whether he wants to be God's freedom fighter or not, he is doing the work, if you know what I mean. So he burns the whole house, the people, incinerates them. Verse 7. And Samson said unto them, though ye have done this, yet I will be avenged of you. And, well, after that we'll be even. Right? Isn't that what he says? I'll cease. Right? That'll settle the score. If you heard the phrase tit for tat, it's a modern equivalent of a 16th century English phrase, tip for tap, which means blow for blow. The phrase in the Bible is eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The phrase it speaks of retaliation. You did that, I'll do that. You do that, you do that. Now, we may not be burning someone's wheat field, and we may not be, doing those kind of things. But she treated me bad, so she gave me the cold shoulder. Or he, here we go. And the people said? So here, Samson vows to answer in kind. So what's equivalent to incinerating your in-laws? I don't know. Well, since their attack wasn't upon him directly, but upon his people, he's justified now to take vengeance upon the Philistines. I tell you what, Israel doesn't want to be delivered. They're not looking for a deliverer. But God said, I got a covenant with you, and I'm going to deliver you, and whether you want to or not. And you're not calling for one, so I'll send a baby. With a Nazarite vow, his mother, and I'll deliver you this way. And he's turning out to be, and even when he, goes right straight to the Philistine camp to get a wife and just crushes his parents. I'm sorry, this has messed us up with God, but God is God. I'm not saying that was right. It broke the hearts of parents, and how many parents have their hearts broken? We're stewards of our children. Come on. Doesn't mean just because you put in the right ingredients, to me, like baking a cake, it's still going to fall. But God says this, don't sweat it. And don't take the blame and don't flay yourself. Because I'm in this. Don't limit God. And don't put him in a box. And don't say God can only use this kind of person, because God can do whatever and God will do whatever he needs to do to accomplish his purpose, because his eternal purpose cannot be controverted. Wow. And it says, so justified for killing family, verse 8 in chapter 15, here he goes. And he, Samson, smote them hip and you thought 30 was bad. Hip and high with what? Talk to me. Great. So now, the phrase hip and high. Now it's interesting. We talked about a riddle. We're going to, in the last thing, we're going to have another riddle here. There's just this thing about the word idiomatic language, and we have all kinds of phrases we use daily. When you're around someone who speaks another language and they're trying to figure out what you're saying in English, and you're using these kind of things, scarce as hen's teeth, things like that. The phrase hip and high thigh in the Hebrew literally reads hip unto thigh, which was an idiom to complete slaughter with viciousness. Now, if you want to see Philistines stack that high, then you go ahead, because he is going to stack them. But it's idiomatic language in the Hebrew that's just talking about, man, was he mad. Verse 8b, and he went down and dwelt in the top of rock Edom. Now, Edom is located in Judah. Samson is from the tribe of Dan. And the word rock here can be translated stronghold, which tends to suggest this is a natural fortification, providing security for Samson. Now, Samson has promised, okay, now I'm going to do this because you burned my wife's and her family. And I'm going to kill these many people, and that's it. I'm going to leave you alone. And that's over. So he does that, and now he retreats to this stronghold in Judah. He took vengeance, and now he's got full intention of leaving the Philistines alone. Did y'all listen to the news tonight? No one's going to accelerate. We've satisfied. We slapped you, and it's all cool. Well, we'll see. But as much as Samson intended to live in peace among the Philistines, it wasn't God's purpose. You ever want to bail from your calling? You ever want to be Jonah and get on a ship and go the opposite direction? Now, well, Samson was destined to be God's freedom fighter before he was conceived. And that's a great pro-choice passage. Because God knows us in the wombs. Come on. God's got a purpose for it all. So we ought to take seriously our birth, as spiritual birth as God's children and our identity. Come on. And we must take seriously God's purpose for our lives. We must. But he's saying, I'm done. Verse 9. And the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah. Okay. So obviously the score is not even. They find out where he is, and they're finding him in Judah. spread themselves in Lehi. So both Edom and Lehi, they're in Judah, which explains why the Philistines came to Judah, not to Dan, which was Samson's tribe and home. And so this thing is spilling over. It's not just personal, it's retaliating against the Philistines. So if Samson is going to, who is appointed before he was born to be a judge, is not going to pursue that. If he's going to be a womanizer, well then I'll use that to make personal offenses, and they will turn into national issues, and my will be accomplished. Whoa! Okay? So now it's not some neat little package with Dan. It's in Judah now. Well, as long as it's over there and not here, I'm okay with it. Well, cancer won't stay in one place. That's the problem. And sin's kind of that way, isn't it? So this aggression on the part of the Philistines leads to Judah's inquiry. So the tribe of Judah and the leadership there wake up one day and they got Philistines. And they're saying, what is going on here? And so they make inquiry. Verse 10, and the men of Judah ask, why are ye, the Philistines, come up against Judah, and why are ye, the Philistines, I'm sorry, I read myself twice. So why are you here? So Israel's unfaithfulness to God is not a Dan problem. It's a national problem. It's not just one tribe. Come on. In verse 10b, and they answered to bind Samson, or we come up to do to him as he hath done to us. So the score is not settled. Philistines, while you're here, we've got a debt. We got a score to settle here, and so that's why we're here. And by the way, enemies never agree on the score. And the Philistines are out to kill Samson because of his attack on their food supply and all of this. And so the Philistines, and killing the 1,000, so Philistines wanted one man. That's all. I don't have a problem with you, Judah. I got a problem with Samson. Okay? They had no quarrel with the nation Israel because they represented no threat. Now, let that soak. Satan was losing no sleep over Israel as a whole. Satan was only ticked off at Samson because he was fighting. Are y'all with me? Israel encountered no opposition because they had not and they were not engaging Satan. And it was Samson who was stirring up Israel. Verse 11, then 3,000 men of Judah, not the Philistines, went to the top of Rock Edom and said to Samson, knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? Man, sometimes the words that come out of our mouth, most times the words that come out of our mouth tell a story more about us than we think or someone else. Come on. Because Judah just revealed their spiritual state right there. What are you doing, man? What are you doing? What is it that thou hast done to us? They're upset at Samson. Samson sought safety and refuge in Judah, but now he's facing opposition, not from the Philistines, but from his own people, the Israelites. Judah sends 3,000 men to face and subdue Samson, and obviously they have a respect, and they've heard something because they've got a respect for his strength. Maybe in the conversation they've had with the Philistines, they let him know what all he did, the 30 that he killed, and then the 1,000, anyway. But now we see why there was no cry in Israel for a deliverer. Are y'all with me? That's right. Samson, all the other judges cried out to God. God sent a deliverer, cried out to God. They came to the end, right, of the cycle of sin. And they said, we're tired of this. We want to deliver. And then, there'd be a confrontation, and they would get sanctified, and they'd have rest, and then the cycle would begin. But this is not like that. And now we see why. We see that. The voice of the men represent the attitudes, and can I say the spiritual aptitudes of all Israel. They had fully accepted their own physical and spiritual bondage. And so, Moses hadn't hardly even gotten out on the other side of the Red Sea. Have you read it? And what happened? Talk to me. Murmur, murmur. They were Baptists. They began to claim. And what were they saying? You brought us out here to kill us. And would to God that we were back in slavery in Egypt. Boy, it's amazing how quickly they forget. And that's what they're saying here. They had come to the point that they preferred slavery. They preferred a life of comfort over a commitment to the riches of a relationship with the God of creation. And Samson's personal issues with the Philistines creates issues with his own people. Now, not just the Philistines, his own people who are upset with him for rocking the boat. And so he makes his countrymen uncomfortable. And the Israelites had rather see Samson dead at the hands of the Philistines than face their sin. I think they call that friendly fire in a conflict. And be restored to the fellowship of God. Wow. Sometimes, we don't let it in and live it out because we'd be rocking the boat. We keep it to ourselves. Verse 11b concludes, and he said unto them, as they did unto me, so I have done unto them. And Samson's locked into this vicious cycle of offense and retaliation with the Philistines, which was foreordained of God. There's decisions made in all of this, and I'm not blaming all of these bad decisions on God. That would be foolish. By the way, you need to read the Bible. The Bible, the best commentary on the Bible is the Bible. And we know in James chapter 1 that God does not tempt us to sin. But he does send trials to test us. So we can't blame God for the bad choices here, but we can't say that the bad choices are going to limit God from doing what he's going to do. And so we need God more than he needs us. Verses 12 and 13, and they said unto him, we are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said unto them, swear unto me that you'll not fall upon yourself, that you won't kill me. And they spake unto him and said, no, but we will bind thee fast and deliver thee into their hand, but surely we will not kill thee. And they bound him with 2 new cords and brought him up from the rock. And so Israel did the enemy's work for them. And this is what it leads. When you're complacent, when we are complacent spiritually, and we're no threat to Satan, then we end up doing his bidding. And that's exactly what they're doing. They tied Samson up. They delivered him to the Philistines. Samson's request of his own countrymen was not to attempt to take his life. But that was more for their sakes. So this has got another wrinkle in it. Just you think that Samson is just one slab of meat and he doesn't have a spiritual pulse. You can't say that because he knows. He does it more for his countrymen's sake than his own. And the last thing Samson desired was take the lives of his own countrymen, because this is not, and we already said this. Now, wow. We said this. Remember that lesson I prepared? We talk about how this was going to be different. And there's more references to the Hebrew word for spirit. Help me, Dwight. Rosh. There's more references to the Hebrew word to the Holy Spirit. And we know how he did back then. He came upon former judges. But more so in Samson's. Now, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? But Samson, it's happened enough, and Samson knows it's going to happen again. Come on. So he knows that if they're the ones, trying to kill him, that they will suffer. We gain a sense here of Samson's awareness of his extension of God's purpose in his life. I tell you, the Bible, I just love God's Word. And the more you read it, the more you're just absolutely amazed at the complexities of it. But given assurance that the men of Judah would keep their word and not attempt to harm him, Samson allows them to bind him. And notice there's 2 new cords. And so the idea there is they're not afraid. Once again, they understand, or at least have heard, the potential of what Samson can do. So they bind him carefully, with his permission, with unused ropes to ensure that they wouldn't break loose. And so we'll get this picture, and this is going to go on the screen. But this will make you stop and think. Samson was bound by 3,000 of his own people, delivered at his own will to thousands of bloodthirsty Philistines shouting for his death. Lord, I'll serve you no matter what. We love Romans 8, we're more than conquerors. But we don't read those verses preceding that or right around that where it says we're counted as sheep. Though we're counted as what? And Jesus is the greatest conqueror ever, and he conquered by the cross. The Israelites told Samson of their plan, and he didn't protest. How could he accept these odds and face the enemy alone? There's only one way that Samson could do this. Is his name listed in Hebrews 11? And Hebrews chapter 11 is a chapter of what? Hebrews 11:32. And what shall I more say? The time should fail me. Tell of Gideon. We know him. And Barak. And who? And Samson. And who? Of David. Of Samuel. And just throw in the prophets. And there's Samson. Only by faith could he say, you bind me. Only faith in God can produce the calm courage evidenced in Samson. Samson had many failings, but you cannot say that he lacked courage. He knew that his God would give him the strength to overcome the enemy. And maybe he counted on that just a little bit too much, but he did count on it. And the just shall live by faith. How many times do we turn back? Not even for what could, but just might happen. Just fear. Fear is our enemy, don't you think? The fear is the currency of the world. And it's a controller. But we cannot be ruled by fear and serve God. Verses 14 and 15. And when he had come to Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him. Okay. So we knew it had happened, didn't we? And the Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of Yahweh came mightily upon him. And the cords that were upon his arms became as flax and burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass and put forth his hand and took it and slew 1,000 men therewith. So we see the new ropes, and now we see a new jawbone. He bought that brand new at Walmart. But once again, the Holy Spirit of God came upon him. He empowers him, challenges him, for the challenge ahead of him, just like before. He finds himself in these life or death situations. And if I die, I die. And then God comes through. And the Holy Spirit, he finds this new, fresh jawbone of a donkey, okay? Handy. I want you to know that the vow of a Nazarite is you can't come. If it's fresh, I tell you, I remember the day when my grandmother, when I was a young kid, said, I want you to go take this wheelbarrow and go pick up cow chips. Because she used them in the flower bed. And I began to discern between a dried one and a fresh one. Point made. If it's fresh, and he's got a Nazarite vow. Figure that in. And get God's going to use that non-kosher animal in a non-kosher state, a Nazarite vow state to serve as a weapon. The fact that this was a new or fresh means it was still considered part of a curse, which is also a violation of the Nazarite vow. So some speculate that because the jawbone was fresh, it was pliable, it was less brittle. We do all of those things, a better weapon in his hands and whatever. But I tell you what, it wasn't the jawbone, it was the Holy Spirit. And Samson responded by killing 1,000 Philistines. Amazing. Verse 16. And Samson said, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. So Samson's already talked one riddle. He's got a flair, and it's idiomatic also among the Philistines. We talked about that. There's some of this that, the Philistines are the sea people. They came from the Aegean Sea. They came from Greece and other places, but they came there first to Africa and then up to Israel. And so some of this stuff was part of the Greek culture as well. So there's a play on words here in this rhyme or this verse, and there's a play in the Hebrew between the word donkey and heap. One rendition is, with a donkey's jawbone I have made a donkey of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men. Another rendition is, with a donkey's jawbone I have heaped 2 heaps. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men. So this may indicate just how he went about doing it. We know, we talk about hip and thigh. Okay? We talk about that. Well, this indicates that maybe he killed a bunch of men and stacked them up and then killed a bunch more. I mean, I don't know, but God came upon him. He named verse 17, it came to pass that when he made an end of speaking, he finished his verse, he finished his song. When he made an end of speaking, he cast away the jawbone out of his hand, called the place Ramath Lehi. It's a compound word, means high and soft, is in a jawbone. Literally, the heel of the jawbone. Ramath Lehi. And evidently, killing Philistines with a jawbone makes you thirsty. So verse 18 says, and he was very thirsty. And listen to him whine. Okay, this is the man who's done all these mighty things, and then listen to him whine. And he called unto Yahweh and said, Thou hast given me great deliverance from the hand of thy servant, but I'm going to die if I don't have a drink. I'm going to die for thirst. Really? Die? And fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. So, anyway, Samson knew the source of his strength. He knew he had been dead meat if it wasn't for God. Isn't that the truth? The safest place to be is in the will of God. The safest place to be is following the purpose that God has for our lives. Come on. And you're talking about well, I fear doing God's will. You ought to fear not doing God's will. And shouldn't we all? Come on. Don't forsake it. I mean, be faithful to it. And so this great victory came by the power of God, as had other victories. And you remember Gideon and that great victory? With just a handful of men. It's amazing. Giving the Lord the glory for his victory. This freedom fighter questions why would God would now let him die. We see that in the life of David. He has this great victory and you think, wow, he's finally, and the next thing you know, he's totally afraid and here he goes. But because we are what we are. And isn't it amazing that God uses us? It remains yet to be seen what God can do with just one person totally yielded to him. We all have feet of clay. And given the Lord the victory, why would God have to die at the hands of the Philistines? Because of being weak from thirst. And here we see the weakness of Samson. Because, after all, he is just a man. Verse 19. But God clave an hollow place that was in the jaw, and there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. And he called the name thereof En-Hakkore, which is Levi to this day, and that is translated the spring of the caller. We're moving through 20 verses. We're about to finish. But you could land it right there and teach a lesson on prayer. That you could go from verse 19 to Isaiah chapter 40. Are y'all with me? Where it says, they that wait upon the Lord shall what? Renew their strength. Wow. He called upon the Lord, and God filled his jawbone. Isn't that amazing? We talk about water coming out of the rock. How about out of a jawbone? Shazam. Verse 20. And he judged in Israel, or judged in or during Israel, during the days of the Philistines 20 years. So we are Westerns. We're Westerners. We are and Americans. We're addicted to this, and we're just really drunk on chronology. And if you're a student of the Bible as a Western mind, it frustrates the hound out of you. And especially in the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament, they had a low value for chronology, even in the Gospels. So that's the reason, we're having a problem, and we talk, well, John doesn't, and here we go. But, we just want to do this, but it could well be that even though we listed and in the book of, but the Philistines, if you dig back earlier with Abimelech and Jephthah, it could be that Samson was maybe contemporary with them. But the important thing in verse 20 before we stop is that there's no mention of the land having rest, and there's no permanent deliverance here, because King Saul is going to have to deal with the Philistines. Come on. And David's going to have to deal with the Philistines. So we have, the Midianites, done with them, they're gone. The deliverance is done, but not here. And maybe that says something about our ongoing battle with sin. But let's digress. Let's take 4 observations from Judges 5 and I'll close. Number 1, sin is enslaving. So like the Israelites, we can become slaves to sin. We can become slaves to Satan. Jesus says in John 8:34, verily I say unto you, he that committeth sin is the servant of sin. Paul tells us in Romans 6:16, know ye not to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey. His servants are ye to whom you obey, whether you sin unto death or obedience to righteousness. So we may have freedom to choose our sin, but we are slaves to the consequences of the sin we choose. And when we sow to the flesh, we will reap of the flesh destruction, and everybody is somebody's slave. And either you're a servant of God or you're a servant of Satan and sin. Second, Christians are called to be freedom fighters. Paul shouts out and stand fast in Galatians 5:1. Therefore, in the freedom, the liberty with Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, there's two applications right here. It's strictly application. He's not talking about sin. He's talking about the law. Because you cannot have victory over sin by the law. And you cannot have victory over sin by self. Because Romans chapter 7, he says, oh, wretched man that I am. But then it's over through the power of the Spirit in chapter 8 that you can have victory over sin and bondage. Come on, talk to me. So this is not just sin, but it's a legalistic answer to sin, which Paul is facing in Galatians chapter 5, if you want to talk about context. So as Christians, we do have an enemy. And we must be freedom fighters. We have our enemy. Well, what's our enemy? The devil, the flesh, and the world. And so we cannot become... And so here's the problem. We're trying to deliver a nation that don't want to be delivered. And try to use a man who doesn't want to be the man. And so what do we have in Samson? Fraternizing with the women, with the enemy. Sleeping with the enemy. Are y'all with me? And you know what James says? You can't cozy up to this world and be a friend of God. No, if you are a friend of the world, you're the what? Enemy of God. Paul in 1 Corinthians 9:27, and I'm only alluding to these. He talks about his own battle with his flesh, and he says, I beat myself. I have to, and this black and blue, or else I become useless for God. Are y'all with me? Your number one enemy is you. Your number one problem is you. If there's anybody that can trip you up, it's you and me. Come on. Here's the third thing. God's freedom fighters are called to a higher standard of warfare and living. We must refuse to be caught up in the never-ending cycle of anger and vengeance. One act of anger calls for another. And enemies never agree on the score. And Paul tells us, and I'm not going to read it, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 4 and 5, that our warfare is different. And the weapons of our warfare are different. Come on. And they're not carnal, but they're spiritual. Come on. And then if you want to flesh that out, you read Romans 12:17, recompense no man what? Provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it possible, as much as lieth within you. Don't you just love the Bible? Because there's some people that you're yoked with, whatever, at work or whatever, they're going to be a pain. As much as possible, live peaceably. Verse 20 gives the challenge. Be not overcome of evil. And here's the hard part. Overcome evil with good. And anybody can do tit for tat. Anybody can respond kind for kind. But it takes God's Spirit in us to do this. Here's the fourth thing. God's freedom fighters must remain true to their calling and purpose. God is the God of our freedom. And Samson judged Israel for 20 years. And it was for this very purpose that he came into this world. We must always live our lives according to the purpose that God has called us. To a great extent, our daily struggle is to maintain our purpose here on earth, which is being conformed into the image of Christ. You say, well, I think my purpose is to win souls. Well, I think my purpose, well, it's not. That's a part of it. But if you're not conformed to Christ, then you're going to have a hard time doing everything else. And God has saved us. He's filled us with His Spirit. He's called us to put on the whole armor of God. He's called us to be strong in the Lord and the power of His might so that we can enter the great fight of faith. And as God's children have not been called to comfort, we have been called to conflict. But we're freedom fighters. We're not terrorists. Jesus conquered by the cross. He conquered death by dying. And sometimes God calls us to take the abuse and smile. And consider ourselves as sheep for slaughter. Put that on a coffee cup. Fill your churches up with that. But Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you'll always have plenty of money in your pocketbook and you'll have all your dreams. And God's children have been called to be freedom fighters. Lights on. Let it in. Live it out. I think we could say maybe, well, if Samson can, we can. If Jephthah can, we can. We can't, minus Christ. Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. We're amazed at how it speaks to us just when we need it. So, Father, may we learn the lessons that we are afforded us right here in this great chapter. May we be encouraged tonight to fight the fight of faith. May we be encouraged tonight to be your freedom fighter and know our purpose and to live for you. In Jesus I pray.